Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial, and today we're going to be talking about the magazines on the ships. And by that I mean the actual magazines where the powder is stored. The term magazine actually goes back to like the 14th, 15th century through several other languages to mean like storehouse or a space where you store things. By the time it gets to English, it's specifically where you're storing ordnance. And by the time you get to the battleship, it is specifically the propellant, the ammunition that you're firing. In the last episode we did, we were talking about magazines, like the booklet magazines, which we find all over the ship, and they actually derive their word from the storehouse as well. Instead of being where you store a bunch of things like physical objects, it's where you store a bunch of different types of stories, essentially. It's where the paper magazine comes from the magazine like we're in right now. So I try not to have any pretense in that video that we were talking about anything other than the paper magazines, but the way the title of the video ended up, a lot of confusion. So in today's video, we're actually talking about the type of magazine that you think we're talking about, and we're talking about just how many of them there are around the ship, how many different types of magazines we have. So right now we are in one of the 16-inch powder magazines. This one is actually for turret number 1 forward of us that way, and it's probably the largest single magazine on the entire vessel. Each turret has several magazines associated with it. Most of these magazines are two-story structures with the upper level feeding powder down to the lower level via a gravity hoist, and then the lower level actually feeding it into the gun. This duplicates the shell storage in the turret, which is also 2 stories tall. Counting these two-story structures as 2 separate magazines, each turret has something like 8 magazines associated with it. I believe turret 3 has the most because the ship is widest back there, which turret 1 has the fewest because of how narrow it gets at the bow. The powder for the 16-inch guns goes straight from a magazine like this to the gun itself, and it's basically in the hoist until it's loaded in the breech. For smaller guns, we've got a couple of different magazine spaces. For example, the 5-inch guns, their magazines, you might have the same magazine feeding 2 separate guns, whereas each 16-inch gun has its own multiple magazines with it. You might have multiple 5-inch guns to a single magazine, but the powder goes from that magazine to an upper handling room prior to going to the gun. Those upper handling rooms in combat zones will also be used as magazines, and that's where you would store your ready service ammunition. This ship doesn't have any missile magazines. The missiles are all stored in their launchers and there are no reloads. I am not aware of this ship ever having any torpedo magazines. However, our anti-submarine helicopter could carry torpedoes. I just don't know if those would have ever been stored on this ship. We did sail in 1983 with an embarked helicopter, so in theory we could have had torpedoes for it. But I've got no evidence for that. It could have just picked up its torpedoes from a destroyer or something like that if it ever carried its own. And again, while our anti-submarine helicopter was able to carry torpedoes, I don't know that it ever did, much less the ship itself. For depth charges, though, we did have a bomb stowage magazine for our aircraft during World War II, back after on turret 3. And that would have probably included something like 200-pound gravity bombs and probably also depth charges for our float planes. Smaller weapon systems would have had more magazines. So for example, the 40mm guns had magazines. They were primarily, but not always, fed off of Broadway, just like the 16-inch and the 5-inch magazines, but not all of them ended up being in the armored citadel. From the magazines, ammunition would be taken to a clipping room where it would be loaded on clips for the 40 millimeter or into 60 round drums for the 20 millimeter. From there, it would go to a ready service ammunition locker. For the 20 millimeter, these are like just safe looking things built onto the deck that would just be near each of the gun mounts itself. For the 40 millimeter guns, they would have just stored clips right around the gun tubs themselves in brackets that were there that would have then had a blue dyed canvas cover that would have covered it. And again, the ready service ammo is out there in these sorts of storage locations for when we're in a war zone, but not like normal sailing around doing nothing. It would be stored in the magazines where it's safer. While many of the magazine spaces no longer service the types of ammunition that they were designed to, for example, the 20 millimeters and the 40 millimeters were all removed, many of those spaces just got repurposed to store other sorts of ammunition throughout the battleship's career. For example, one of the 40 millimeter clipping rooms became the Rado storage magazine for the rockets that helped the RPV drone take off. One of the 40 millimeter magazines got converted into the white phosphorus ammunition magazine for the 5-inch guns. Some of the 40 millimeter magazines get converted to 20 millimeter CWIS ammunition magazines. But there's definitely fewer magazines on the ship in the 80s than there were in the 40s. And some of those magazines go away entirely. One of the 40 millimeter magazines, forward of turret 1, gets converted into chemical weapons, protective equipment storage, things like that. So, like you found out in our video last week, we had magazine racks for paper magazines all over the ship, and we had even more magazines for ammunition around the ship. I didn't even get into the lockers that small arms and small arms ammo was stored in, but we had a couple of those throughout the ship's career as well, both for ship's company. Many of the ones in the 80s for ship's company were actually former 40 millimeter magazines, but also for the ship's Marine detachment, which stored their weapons separately. So which type of magazines do you think got more use on the battleship? Let us know in the comment section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of private individuals and businesses. We really appreciate their support. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to donate to support the museum. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about us and the channel. Thanks for watching.